Hi, this is Paul. I'm going to do some thinking about God number one and God number two and natural law. Now, I'm going to be on vacation for what to the channel might not feel like any time at all or might feel like 2 weeks. I'll have a couple of conversations banked up for then, but I don't know what my usual daily postings will look like, if I'm posting daily or if I'll be able to post much at all or if I'll post more. Vacations are weird for me because the channel is partly work, but really partly just a way to record my thoughts. And when I go on vacation, depending on what kind of vacation and who I'm with, either I'll have more thoughts to record or fewer thoughts to record. Now, one of the things that I've pointed out a number of times on this channel now over the last number of weeks is that I've started a Substack, and I'm sort of using that Substack in conjunction with Twitter. I'm using it in conjunction with Twitter to sort of rein in, add some constraints to me. Part of my ADHD difficulty with writing is that just as in my videos, it gets so divergent, and so I'm always wrestling with frames that will sort of keep me disciplined so that I can do something, so that I can get a little bit of productivity out of my chaotic brain. So this morning, actually, I wrote a Substack. I didn't post a video this morning. When will I post this one? I might post it today. See, this is the way it goes with my channel. My channel is horribly unplanned. I don't plan or organize much, and we'll get into planning and organizing a little bit later when we get into natural law and some of my issues with the formulation of it. We'll say it that way. But first, God number one and God number two is a regular question that I have people asking me about. And so I actually wrote a Substack about it after I saw that Tom Holland, I knew that they announced this, that they're going to do a World Cup of Ancient Gods. And I thought, well, that's fun. And it's, I think, really important. And even just the graphic in his tweet is very much sort of superhero Marvel Cinematic Universe movie type things, which I think in terms of our imaginary is exactly where it should be. And it prompted a lot of thinking about my God number one and God number two. And I'll just read through this, and the link to this will be in the notes. Now, again, part of the reason I started with the Substack and the Twitter summaries of my videos is that not all of us have hours in our day in order to listen to videos. And actually, the truth for me is that some days I have a lot of time to listen to videos and podcasts, and some days I have no time at all. And so not everybody, people will often come on and apologize that they haven't watched all of my videos. And I think some of you have lifestyles where this works for you. Others of you don't. And I have a good number of friends who tell me, I'd really love to watch your videos, but I just don't have time. And what they do have time for is probably a 500 to 1,000 word blog post. And so that's how I'm using Substack. And I'm using it to try to organize and constrain and put a little bit of order into my chaotic learning experience, which is really what this YouTube channel is. So this is the Substack today. Finally, some clarity on God number one and God number two. It began for me with the Jordan Peterson-Sam Harris debate. My favorite podcast, my favorite podcasts can change almost daily sometimes, but this has been favorite for a couple of months now. I really enjoy The Rest is History as a podcast. My favorite podcast, yes, I'm a Protestant, along with all those of you who identify as atheist, is doing a World Cup of the Gods. I think this is genius. Tom Holland writes in his tweet, excited to announce, talking of the Rest of History World Cups, that the Ancient Gods World Cup will be kicking off in a fortnight's time. Fans of high-octane, adrenaline-pumping elite sport should on no account miss it. And yeah, I'm excited. But now, this will be great fun, but it will obviously cause practicing Christians and other religious people to tremble. And, when they talked about doing this in a previous podcast, right away they realize that, well, this can't just sort of be safely pushed back into the past. What were these gods? What are these gods? And for those of you who say enjoy listening to a reliable evangelical like John Walton, even though, of course, anything that any academic puts out will be debated quite a bit. In many ways, these gods in the ancient world were functionaries. And so in John Walton's The Lost World of Genesis 1, what's interesting about the Hebrew Scriptures are that in the Genesis 1 account, part of how it differs from the rest of the ancient world is that they're not gods, but they're seemingly, see now, you just can't talk about this stuff without running across lines, natural processes. But that's not how they experienced them in the ancient world. And phenomenologically, sort of in a Peugeotian sense, that's not how we experience them. We experience them as alive, motivated and moved by something. So, what are these gods? And so, Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook are going to have a lot of fun with this. And Christians are going to start feeling uncomfortable. Are we violating one of the 10 Commandments? How are we to think of these gods? Now, every attentive lad or lass in Sunday school knows that there is God, capital G, and the gods, lowercase g. And part of... See, I can't just finish my sentences with these things because they get so horribly complicated so very quickly. You shall have no other gods before me. What gods are you talking about? Moses or the Lord thundering from Sinai? What other gods would we have before you? And of course, that gets into, I forget he works for Logos, and he's done a lot of writing about the heavenly court. And recognizing, basically pulling back, and the Bible Project guys have done this, sort of pulling back modernity to once again expose many of the subtextual layers in the biblical text where they've sort of been often covered up by contemporary translations that, well, why are we talking about these gods? And what is exactly happening in the beginning of the book of Job, where God is sort of holding court? And who are these beings that come before him? Are we to, recontextualize them as angels? Or what framework do we fit these things in? But, one of the things that I noticed in Plato, so again, a number of years ago, I was reading Dallas Willard's The Divine Comedy because I was working on the Sermon on the Mount. It's always working on the Sermon on the Mount, it seems. And, he was getting into... Dikaiosune and that conversation in the ancient world. And so I decided I wanted to, read some of Plato's Republic in Greek because I had always read English translations, and, my Greek isn't fabulous by any means, but, with a pony, I can sort of make my way through. And I'm reading along in Plato and realizing, well, of course, I mean, the Plato's Republic begins down at the port where they're having a celebration of the gods, but every now and then Plato talks about God singular. And of course, Sam Adams will jump in and say, well, that's the Godhead. And of course, Sam's Unitarian role that he's playing in the estuary is to sort of, okay, we're reliving late antiquity, early church council conversations about what are these terms that we're using, because if, as Brett Sockold would note, Martin Luther goes after Aquinas and Aristotle in hopes of trying to somehow recapture what Aquinas and Aristotle were getting at, but the philosophical underpinnings had all slipped, and so he postures Aquinas and Aristotle as his enemies, and Brett Sockold comes along and says, sorry, Martin, it's not really your fault. The conversation had changed between you and Aristotle. or between you and Aquinas. And a lot of history had happened. And, it wasn't just a dark age where everything was static. A great deal of stuff was happening during that period. And you weren't reading Aquinas with proper eyes. And so now Sockhold comes back and says, well, Luther and Calvin are sort of trying to get back at what Aquinas talked about in transubstantiation. So as many of you know who've been following this channel for a long time, I don't even remember who recommended it, but someone along the way recommended, I could probably go back and find, and if you want to produce yourself, that's fine, and take credit for it, recommended Christine Hayes's lecture 2 in her series that's on YouTube on the Hebrew Bible, and brought in the meta-divine realm, and brought in Kaufman. And I mentioned in my tweet, there weren't a lot of these books out there, and I got an early one, so I got it for $7 or $8 probably. But now the only ones you can find are for hundreds of dollars. And it's like, oops, sorry, didn't mean to wreck the used book market in this book. Something's going on, and something was going on deep beneath the imaginary of the Hebrews and the ancient world, and all of our attempts to sort of get at it are feeble attempts. And you've got, well, what do we mean when you have the Gods World Cup? There's a meta-divine realm, and it seemed, well, my YouTube Odyssey was jolted when a viewer of my videos asked if I'd ever watched this video. This led to a number of things, including wrecking the economy around a certain used book. I'd already come up with my working boxes of God number 1, which is really Jordan Peterson's God, and God number 2, the God of Sam Harris loves not believing in. After listening to their first chat with Brett Weinstein, what do you mean by God? The Hebrews had their God, capital G, but it wasn't like the other people's gods. The Hebrews never really disbelieved in the gods, but they acted out their relationship with their God, and the normal ravages of history seem not to destroy their God, unlike the gods of Babylon and all of the other gods, the Roman gods, the Greek gods. The God of the Hebrews finally took them all out in a very Jordan Peterson-esque Darwinian truth sort of way. Now, they're still sort of beneath the surface. They're still sort of lurking in the corners. I read Gaiman's American Gods, found it to be a fascinating book. The gods of the ancient world couldn't do anything. And what I mean by that is not that they couldn't do anything, but they couldn't do anything. They were limited. They were limited by their meta-divine realm. And village atheists, it's really folk atheism. You would ask questions like, can God create a rock too big for even God to lift? And, you get these things in grade school, and you sit and you think about them, and they're always sort of dismissed with the left hand. They're always sort of dismissed as, well, you can't, it's a logical inconsistency. Well, then is God bound by the laws of logic? And if God is bound by the laws of logic, then he's, and that gets into all sorts of ancient and medieval theological debates that most practical people just sort of push to the side, because it becomes very clear that these debates aren't getting you anywhere. But along, of course, comes Vervaeke and the agent-arena relationship. And, well, you know what? A question like, can God create a rock too big for even God to lift, is really an agent-arena. It exposes the agent-arena relationship. And the reason the question just sort of seems to confuse us and juggle our categories. And again, there are lots of logical ways out of that question, and go ahead and put them in the comments. That's fine. But it's a function of the agent and arena, because the identity of God is a function of the arena. which is why polytheists, as we call them, but classical polytheism, in many ways tried to somehow represent the agentic aspect of the arena in a variety of ways. And, I didn't have time to go looking for it, but, it was one of Tom Holland's books I think it was one of Tom Holland's books where he was talking about the fates. And, even the gods are sort of subject to the fates. And, so in pagan antiquity, you have all of these ways of trying to represent the agentic aspect of the arena, but these aren't gods. They're hard for us to represent because it's this agent arena. It's this agent arena relationship that we somehow have to represent in story and in narrative, and it's tremendously difficult because narrative is completely dependent upon agent arena relationships. In that way, the author of the narrative creates the world in which the agents operate. And that's, I play that trick often when I ask, can Tolkien be found in Middle-earth? And this annoys people and delights other people. And they right away they don't quite know how to answer the question, but they know that I'm playing a trick on them. It's because Tolkien has created the arena, and the agents operate within the arena, and Tolkien is everywhere in Middle-earth. But Tolkien, again, sees himself as a sub-creator, so even he isn't fully in charge of the arena. Because in many ways, whether or not these texts become living texts depends on whether Tolkien can actually plug into he fit his sub-creator arena within our arenas. And storytellers are always working on this. And we see this when a narrative or a story or a movie or something comes out and it breaks something. It breaks canon, because part of canon is, in fact, that whole agent-arena relationship. So the Hebrews managed to identify the arenic God, which is what I call God number one, as a character in the story. That's a huge accomplishment. There seems to be other attempts in other religions, the faiths, for example, but they are never really like the Hebrew Lord, that problematic character of the Old Testament. And again, if I just put the link here to that place where Sam Harris asks, well, what do you mean by God? And Peterson basically lays out something of a God number one. Christianity turns up the heat when it declares that a human being who was born, lives, dies, rises, and ascends into heaven within history is the God, not a God, because then we'd be back with a polytheist subject to their meta-divine realm. And so, it's both tremendously blessed and bothersome in our little estuary to have a sea monster like Sam Adams and his biblical Unitarian, because, a lot of the other Unitarians are sort of easy to dismiss because they're not offering a crunchy religion, the kind of crunchy religion that I need. And some of you have sort of chuckle at the crunchy religion. I get that from Tim Keller, who probably got it from somewhere else, but you get the sense of it, right? In the language. Pastors are terrible word thieves. We're always stealing words from each other and from you. But it's part of the declaration of Christianity, of at least Trinitarian Christianity, that Jesus is God, as the Father is God, and the Spirit is God. It is sort of straddling this agent-arena relationship and is just difficult for us to sort of comprehend. This frames the rest is history World Cup of Gods, because as they say, the house, and I capitalized house intentionally, the house always wins. So someone left a comment. Let's see what they said. Dare you name name of this unnamed used book? Maybe I'll leave that as a little something for someone to look for. Anyway, so I've said many times when asked about God number 1 and God number 2, why don't I name them more properly? Well, partly because there are sort of these boxes on my workbench, and Benjamin Boyce and I have a conversation scheduled for early next week before I go on vacation. And he wants to talk about God number 1 and God number 2. And, that I just sort of, the God number 1 and God number 2 thing is a great example of the productivity of my YouTube learning project, because I say things and I don't know if these things have any value until you start spitting them back to me. And in fact, it's partly a measure of their value by the earnestness with which you spit them back to me. And God number 1 and God number 2 kept coming back up, and attempts to map it on the Trinity. And no, it's not. It's not an attempt to map it on the Trinity, because quite properly in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all persons. But they're not three gods, but one God. And so this is the, and perhaps that's a way to sort of think about the Trinity, is the agent-arena relationship. I don't know, that's just off the top of my head. Might be totally wrong, and I might start an entire, well, it's a good thing my channel isn't too big, because I'm not looking to start an entire school of heresy based from my YouTube channel, although I recognize that that's certainly a potentiality and a danger. But this gets into this question of natural law. Now, this agent-arena relationship, I think, has a lot to do with natural law. Now, again, Carl, who is famous in the comments section for first praising me, then cursing me, because I, on one hand, don't dismiss God number 1, which is sort of like natural law. It's very much related to natural law, the arenic God. But Carl gets frustrated with my continual commitment to God number 2, the personal God. God as person, God as agent within the arena. And so, but Bionic Mosquito, who's a regular in the comment section too, and writes, really excellent comments. Carl wrote excellent comments too. I learned a ton from Carl, and he didn't always behave himself well in the comment section, but I know that when Carl was sort of in his heyday in the comment section, I got repeated back channel requests to ban him, and I thought, no, in an estuary you need a few sea monsters, and sea monsters evoke heroes that will rise to slay them. So generally speaking, leave the sea monsters alone. And in a way for me to ban Carl would have been using some of my arenic powers to eliminate his agency, let's say. So we'll play with that. But I got a really nice email from Bionic Mosquito, who also wrote a blog post. And so let's take a look at those. And then I want to look at Andrea with the bangs and Richard Rowland's terrific conversation that Andrea just posted on her channel not too long ago with only about 400 views so far. I thought it was a tremendous conversation. I'm becoming a big Richard Rowland fan, so I'm going to have to start listening to his podcast too, as if I didn't have enough good stuff to listen to. Pastor Paul, I found your discussion of natural law confusing. I'm glad that you have at least touched on the topic, but if you are going to pursue it, I will encourage you to understand it better and to give it an appropriate treatment. Fair enough. The foundation of and objective for natural law ethics is to be found in man's purpose. Man's purpose is beatitudo, so that's beatitude, all right? Happiness. Normally translated happiness, but not the superficial meaning as we know from the term today. Better translated as fulfillment through other regarded action, love. It doesn't get more relational than that. Jesus said the same thing, then answering the question about the greatest commandment, love. Now, love, part of what we're dealing with is some of the same stuff that Brett Sockel dealt with in his book Transubstantiation. The meanings of these words keep changing. I just saw an interesting tweet this morning from Eric Weinstein about the money as instrument of exchange versus money as conservation, a tool of conservation of value. And he was thinking about that in terms of cryptocurrency, which I think is a very interesting question. I see Jonathan Peugeot just did a video on cryptocurrency, the symbolism behind cryptocurrency, which I'm definitely going to watch. But words have this same thing. Words have the question of value of exchange of knowledge versus preservation of knowledge. And they're not perfect in either score, but they're the best we've got. I'll say it that way. Non-believers wouldn't put it this way, yet he still is brought to tears. A non-believer wouldn't put it this way, yet he still is brought to tears when Tony Stark snaps his fingers in Endgame. How can this be? The Apostle Paul offers the answer, Romans 2:14. Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law were written in their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times even defending them. Now, two words to watch in that verse are nature and law. Because whereas there's both words retain a value of exchange between us and the Apostle Paul, what Paul meant by law, I don't think we can just sort of imagine we know right off the bat. And this is part of the issue that N.T. Wright wrestles with the Reformation and, a new reading of Paul that has emerged over the last 20 or 30 years. And how are we to understand law and how are we to understand nature? Because I don't think we can read the word nature without passing through deism and the scientific revolution and modernity. And for that reason, we need to pay a lot more attention to the medievals and the classical authors. And the same with law. And I'm wrestling with that with my Pentecost sermon, because in many ways, what I'm doing, a little anticipation for my rough draft for Sunday this week, I've worked for the Acts 2 passage. I've worked it a variety of ways. Fire, as in baptized with fire. There's lots of symbolic hyperlinks in Acts 2 with many high voltage carrying portions of Scripture. One that I have not worked yet in all of my years of preaching is really the relationship between Sinai and Pentecost. And right there we have, I think, once I begin to see and work the connections between law at Sinai and law in Paul and law and Spirit, some things become illuminated when we set Exodus 19 and 20 alongside Acts 2. What happens when the Spirit is given, and how does that relate to the law? Now, again, this is an old and fierce debate within the Protestant Reformation. It divides Calvinists from Lutherans, and Calvinists and Lutherans from Anabaptists, and Roman Catholics from Calvinists and Lutherans and Anabaptists. It's all the question, how are we to regard the law? And of course, Luther, well, the law is done. And Calvinists say, no, I think the law can be used as an expression of grateful obedience, misery, deliverance, gratitude, if you deny my Calvinism, as many do, because I don't identify. I think the whole free will debate and Calvinism is also a function of the agent-arena relationship distortion field. It's just confusion field. It's just difficult for us to figure it out. Again, this is an excellent email. I'll keep reading. God has written the natural law on men's hearts. Okay, now let's pay attention to just how symbolic and metaphorical that is, because I get a sense of reading it in especially Protestant Reformational and even Roman Catholic post-Reformation that it's very real to us and it doesn't feel terribly metaphorical, even though at the outset we understand that what writing is God doing on our hearts, which are these organs we use to pump blood? No, that's not what I mean. Okay, well, let's figure out what we do mean, because in terms of atheists, there's a tremendous amount of skepticism in terms of hearts and law and nature, because nature's radically changed, and law, we're not really, atheists will talk about laws of physics, but you start talking about natural law, which impinges on, especially the context in which it's come up most lately, which is human sexuality, they throw it away. So physical laws, yes. Natural law, no. But wait a minute, physics and nature, they're sort of the same thing. So just as I'm not satisfied with just continuing to spout reformational formulations, neither am I satisfied just spouting, modernist Roman Catholic formulations. And I've got a tremendous amount of concern after reading Brett Sockel that, well, I'm going to handle Aquinas with care, because, Luther and Calvin didn't do so well with old Tom, and they're a lot better read on him than I am. So, and I know there's a bunch of big Aquinas fans out there and some Aquinas channels, but I'm limited by time and space too. So, use what you can from me with profit and mix it with them and make your own channel and contribute to the estuary. That's part of why, I'm just one creature in the estuary, and maybe I've established somewhat of an estuary arena here, which to me is the most satisfying part of it. But I learned from you all, and you learned from me. And so, Bionic Mosquito's email to me is, a really helpful thing, because I'm learning as I'm going. C.S. Lewis develops this in the appendix to The Abolition of Man. Yeah, and this is where things are going to get a little screwy, because Lewis was very self-conscious when he'd use the word law. And he wrote about this quite a bit, as if somehow suddenly the agent-arena relationship kicks in when you use the word law. It's a very arenic word, and it puts us in a specific arena. And some versions of the Golden Rule, Beatitude, is found in every major religion. Let the non-believers believe whatever they want about why this is so. We know it is so because God made man in his image and breathed into man, giving him a soul. Again, part of the reason non-believers don't believe that is because of the formulation. And as an evangelist and as a Christian minister, my job is to take a look and to try to capture the thing that our language captured very well in previous centuries, but is no longer working today. And part of the reason for a lot of atheists and non-believers that I sound so different is because what most Christians do, Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants alike, is they just keep repeating the old words. And now some people will take the lesson and absorb it, but the majority will not. And of the majority that will not, the vast majority of those that will not are the little people, the common people, the people who ask dumb, quote unquote, dumb questions, which is, in my opinion, why I think Andrea is, if there's someone I want Jordan Peterson to talk to, there's a lot of people, it's a pretty big list, but I think one of the best interviewers for Jordan Peterson would be Andrea with the bangs. Why? And some of you would be like, that woman that you and Peugeot talked to, and she called herself silly, and Peugeot and I both said, you're not silly. You're you. Keep being you. And I don't mean that in this kind of modern self-expressive sense, but because, I wrote in the comment to the video that I'm about to play, she's maybe the most honest woman on YouTube. Why? She's not afraid to ask a question if she doesn't know something. And she's an honest learner who's attentive to the conversation. And she doesn't, unlike many of us who spout off a lot on, have some aspirations to being the smartest person on the internet. That's what makes her interview so valuable. Her interview with David Fuller, I thought, was tremendous. She asks honest questions, and she's not afraid to be herself. That's a rare commodity in a world which is desperately trying to establish themselves via their own insecurities by trying to impress one another. And, when I think about certain interviews that I've given on my channel, that's part of the reason I don't pursue high status people, because certain things inside of me that I don't like get triggered, and I'm working to mortify some of those things. Anyway. PVK, what's the relationship of the law of the Lord has seen in Psalm 1 and natural law? God wrote it on man's hearts. There's your metaphor. And it's a perfectly good metaphor. And it's a biblical metaphor. But say that to an atheist. God is problematic. Writing is metaphorical. Hearts is sort of understandable. It isn't going to win a day. You need to figure out another way to say it. How much closer a relationship can there be? But this is where this deep conflict between karma and Job comes in. Because in a way, natural religion is nested within this conceptualization, which is far newer, of natural law, that do good things and good things happen, do bad things and bad things happen. And what that does is critique and beg for recalibration of all of our assumptions of what natural law is and our grasp on it. That's exactly why we work on the things we do. And that's why I believe we have to, it keeps theologians and pastors and evangelists in business, because this is what we're always working on. And why was it that Jordan Peterson could be a more effective evangelist than Bishop Barron? And Bishop Barron is a formidable, impressive man. I mean, I wish I knew. I mean, he's forgotten way more theology than I ever knew. It's just the reality of it. PVK, human rights aren't objective either. You don't dig them up in the backyard and find human rights in the dirt. Human rights are objective. You see, now we're in this modern frame. The frame is going away. The frame is going away. Part of the reason Christianity is losing influence, it's because Christians found the magic words that used to work, and they just keep repeating them, and they're not working anymore. Well, I'll tell you, magic is a function of the meta-divine realm. Magic borrows from the rules of the arena. The magician is an agent in the arena, and the magic words are not working. We need new ones. That's what this channel has always been all about, because I don't have them and I'm looking for them. And I don't want to no longer be a faithful witness. I want to be a more effective witness. And I completely understand that wandering from the tried and true magic words is tremendously dangerous, but we must go out and leave the hobbit hole and go and find trolls and dragons and dwarves and orcs and elves and Lake Town. The questions of owning slaves in ancient Rome versus owning slaves is interesting. If natural law never changes, why is it considered ethical to own slaves, force sex on non-citizens, etc.? Perhaps it took the incarnation to make natural law visible and or knowledgeable. I absolutely believe in that statement, but I wouldn't use natural law as a way to express it. In fact, that is exactly what Dominion, that's the point of this book, Dominion, that I keep pointing to, because Jesus somehow makes, Peugeot doesn't say natural law, he says pattern, 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 pattern. People who like the word natural law, either because they're some kind of non-church going libertarian, or because they're a Roman Catholic, or because they're a fan of natural law in whatever place, keep saying natural law, and Peugeot says pattern, 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 and Peugeot gets a hearing. And Peugeot is doing the work of evangelism, because he's using pattern instead of natural law in many respects. And some who are listening for natural law hear pattern, pattern, say, oh yeah, natural law, natural law. But Peugeot's not using that word for a reason. His audience is teaching him. Bionic Mosquito said, be kind. I hope I'm being kind. I hope I'm being gentle, even though I'm emphatic. But I'm not doubting your natural law or the thing that you're expressing by using those words, natural law. I'm simply saying we need new words, and Peugeot's already got pattern, 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 pattern down. And I'm trying to figure out what he's saying too. The question, how do I live? The answer is easy. Really? It's not easy for me. According to man's purpose. A second question, how do I find meaning? Well, you should have asked another question. How do I find man's purpose? Well, this is a reformational conversation. To know God and love him forever. Smaller Westminster Confession. It's right there. What does that mean? How can I know God? God number one? Well, natural law is in a way of saying God number one. But I relate to that God relationally, as if God is a person. Or three, God number two. The agent-arena relationship is a real relationship, but in a sense it comes together in Christ. And so a way that lots of people can understand is, I follow the pattern of Christ. But wait a minute, I'm not a first century carpenter. Oh, I know. So you have to discern the pattern, and it has to be translated into us here and now, into a pastor on Florin Road in Sacramento, into, whoever Bionic Mosquito is. Why? How do I find meaning? The answer is easy, by living according to man's purpose. What is man's purpose? Beatitude. Psalm 1 and 2 beatitude. There it is, natural law. It's right there. And the Hebrews, this is what we do. And then the Babylonians come down and destroy the temple. And Ezekiel is by the canal. Now we're thinking Ezekiel saw an extraterrestrial. Well, sort of. Jesus is an extraterrestrial in some ways. He's also completely terrestrial. Heidelberg Catechism puts that together. So, what is man's purpose? To know God and to love him forever. What does that mean for me? Well, that's what the Christian life is working out. This is why the search for meaning must incorporate the importance of natural law ethic. All right. Once you put ethic on it, because in some ways natural law is somewhat analogous to the scientific method, it's static. It's law, right? But It has to be integrated into the manifest image. That's where we have God number 2. So God number 1, scientific image. God number 2, manifest image. That's why I keep these 2 boxes, box 1 and box 2, on my theological workbench, because I keep putting stuff in. Oh, that doesn't quite fit. Put other things. So you have transcendence, immanent. That kind of works. And personal, general revelation, special revelation, that sort of maps. And that's why I keep the boxes 1 and 2 out there. And I keep finding ways in which dualities that sort of work with it. And sort, right now it's the agentic and the Irenic. It's kind of crowding out the other ones because it's providing knowledge, it seems to me. This is why the search for meaning must incorporate the importance of natural law ethic. Yeah, but I'm not going to use those 3 words. Peugeot is using pattern. Peterson is sort of dead reckoning with meaning and saying, well, we've sort of seen the nations everybody in the world wants to live in. And it is why I believe the discussion you and others are having must grapple with and incorporate an understanding of natural law. Yes, but the thing behind those words. And we're going to need new words. Now, those words might continue to be used profitably within a whole variety of social and cultural and educational settings for a few more centuries. But they're not working, with fans of how many YouTubers on internet, because nature has been completely reformulated, and law in a religious context, no thank you. I want to do what's authentic. So maybe we should use divine authenticity. Ooh, a lot of people would wake up when they'd hear divine authenticity. John Piper used Christian hedonism and, sparked some good things with that, I think. Now, I've got my own critiques of John Piper, but that's the point of a pastor. We use different words. Natural law. As such, if you have to, as a pastor, if you have to spend college courses explaining a word in order to sell the word, it's not going to work as a pastor or as an evangelist. Divine authenticity. Maybe that's better. I don't know. I just threw it out. Just came up. And that's why I'm using YouTube. We'll see if it comes back at me and people say, oh, and then I get a response and it's like, oh. It's sort of like, Thomas Edison putting different filaments in his little vacuum bulb. And that one lasted. Okay, let's try another one. That's what I'm doing. If you've gotten this far, I will remind you of 2 names I suggested that would take for worthwhile conversation on this topic. Father Dominic Legge of the Thomist Institute, or any of the friars that are versed in natural law, and Tom Woods. And again, I'm not picking a fight with these guys at all. And I'm not denying this. And now I'm going to use this word order. See, I got to use language. But and it could be that, this, because the way things, the natural waves and the normal imaginary, these things rise and fall, and maybe their new day is coming. But my same response with the wave into orthodoxy is, on one hand, praise God. I'm thrilled that the Orthodox Church I'm thrilled that the Orthodox Church is the kind of net that is taking in new fish from this chaotic religious sea that we're working. I wish more fish to enter their net. But those fish will stretch and reshape the Orthodox net. And this is a natural, I use the word, and good process that God is using. And this, may the same be said of the Thomists. Praise God. May your nets be filled. I want that. These are good things. Luther erred when he too quickly dismissed Thomism, although Thomism, I'm sure, gets some things wrong too. I mean, that's all of us. The same for Calvinism. I want God's kingdom to come, his will to be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's my job. It's my goal. It's my life. It's what I'm about. But these words are strands in the net. They're worms on the hook. And sometimes we got to find new ones because there's lots of different fish. And God wants his banquet table to be filled with fish. Mixed metaphor. So then Bionic Mosquito put in a link to his blog, and I'll put that link below in case any of you want to follow it and read it. I skimmed it, and I think I know what you're talking about, but I'm not going to use those words very much because I don't think they help me in my mission of catching fish. Remember Freddie? Reeling them in. So again, here's a terrific interview with Andrea with the Bangs and Richard Rowland about love. But again, so Aristotle has, in a sense, the world moving by love. The divine mover. All those layers, all those spheres. And so Andrea had, where's my copy? Andrea had Richard in to talk about the discarded image, which in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, they did a book study on the discarded image. And let's listen to what he has to say about this book and the project.
Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I got to doing that. So basically what he's doing is he's proposing a model, and we have a model that we use to think about the world right now. And the problem is, of course, that it's falling apart, right? That's basically the whole reason you have this channel. And a lot of other people have channels where they have these wonderful, fascinating discussions on YouTube and elsewhere.
It's sense-making. So, of course, Rebel Wisdom has this whole conversation about sense-making. And what is sense-making about? It's about, well, our model is falling apart, and we need a new model. And we need a new model collectively, the collective map that we all participate in. And we need a new model individually. And, of course, language is in many ways the connections between that. I saw some of Russell Brand did a thing on UFOs, and so he's talking about consciousness and stuff. Well, how this mapping happens isn't that mysterious. Well, in some ways it's deeply mysterious, but it happens through language, it happens through behavior, it happens through drama. We don't have it mapped because it's too massive for us to map, but we certainly know many of the elements by which this stuff maps, and it becomes our culture, how we act things out, and our current model is breaking down, and so we're working on new ones, and this is a great amount of the work of the estuary that we're working in.
It's because the model that we've all used up to this point is falling apart. And we are in need of something to replace it with. And so the question is, what's going to step in and fill that void?
You are fast-forwarding to my last question, Richard.
I'm sorry. Well, I just want to sort of explain. So what that old model is, we'll talk about what might replace it later.
Yes.
What that old model
I have it written down, the question. So.
Yeah. So what that old model is a not the medieval model, but the model that was kind of current at Lewis's time. Is a way of basically something that starts with the Enlightenment.
Now Lewis's time is the middle of the 20th century. That's important.
Starts with the whole idea, even in Christian circles, of natural law. And that is basically that there are these laws which govern the universe. They make the universe knowable and understandable. And if you violate these laws, then things start to go sideways for you in one way or the other.
Which is basically what Bionic Mosquito wrote. These are these laws. Now, why is it that atheists keep wanting to talk about, laws of science? I mean, this law formulation, and of course, Lewis every now and then sort of takes a jab at this and says, well, you're sort of making the you're making this a citizen because it's obeying the law. And that's a perfectly reasonable formulation, and it's very useful in terms of today, but let's think about nation states. Let's think about tyranny. I mean, what realms of language are we using for this? And is it the best one? Again, it's perfectly serviceable, and we're going to keep using it for centuries to come, but I don't know that as a pastor and an evangelist, it works for people who haven't spent all kinds of time in certain classrooms. And in fact, those classrooms have changed dramatically in the last decade.
Okay.
Now, this can apply to something like the law of gravity, right? But it can also apply to like the idea of moral law. So when people make a case, for instance, in a case for like Roman Catholic social ethics, theology of the body, and that sort of thing, all of that thinking is based on the idea of natural law. So there are these laws that should govern sexual behavior, and there are these laws that should govern.
And once we have a divine law that governs sexual behavior, well, shouldn't our civil law reflect the divine law? Absolutely. Yes, but we get a little nervous about that. And see, don't you notice that we're right back into the reformational questions? And we've been basically adjudicating these things for the last 500 years. And a lot of what happens is that things underneath change, and the political structures are always that they only have plausibility, and they only work in a citizenship and in a population for whom the religious battles have already been resolved. I was listening to, I haven't finished it yet, but the rest is history, on Cromwell. Why did monarchies collapse as they did? And why did more democratic forms arise as they did? And in many ways, this pattern of using natural law and its argument of having it being reflected in civil law is a remnant of that. And again, it's an absolutely, as a formulation, it absolutely makes sense, but yelling it again and again and again is no longer working. Just isn't. And so you say, well, if you want to get ahead of it, work in the area of religion, not law, because the civil law always follows the religion of the people. Now it's back and forth, and it's a tussle, but and I don't mean that. I mean that if you're actually going to reformulate and have people act out what the thing behind natural law is, you're going to have to reformulate the mediating language between that thing and the people. And until you do so, you're going to have chaos.
The way that parents raise their children and things like this, and that if you violate those laws, then the consequence of violating those laws is going to be it's going to be pain. It's going to be sorrow. It's going to be, these various things are going to result. And those are sort of just like natural consequences, or natural, you could almost say like punishment for breaking the rule, right?
Right.
But it's immediate punishment. It's not necessarily. So let's say in the United States, that there's still in the United States remains a stigma against cheating. Okay. Now, people aren't even married, but they still act out that whole cheating business. He was going out and he did something with her. That's cheating. And so that still remains in our culture. Let's imagine the United States government decided to pass a law against cheating. Well, that's been tried many times throughout history. Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. I would imagine in the medieval period, there were significant laws against cheating or adultery, let's say. So, but if it's mediated by the civil authority, it's mediated. And you would argue that there are many immediate penalties for adultery that play out in someone's life. And that is the working. Again, natural law, you can use that formulation, but most people today won't jump to their mind in terms of natural law. You might be able to sell natural law with an example like that. It still has some traction. I'm not going to deny that, but a lot of the groups that are just out there banging on the natural law drum, I don't see that as coming back. Again, it doesn't mean it's just like, in a sense, the flat earth. The earth is flat, especially here in the Central Valley of California. That's how it appears. But the flat earthers probably aren't going to have their day anytime soon, because in our imaginary, and that's, so he prefers social imaginary to worldview. Probably because he himself, and at some point I'll probably talk to Richard Rowland, I hope so. If he was a Baptist minister, he was probably downstream of the whole worldview language craze that happened because of Chuck Colson. And, of course, that got all the Reformed people excited because we'd been using that worldview language for a long time downstream from Kuyper and Bavinck in the Dutch Reformed world. And so that then got popularized in the evangelical world for a hot minute. But when he uses social imaginary, he's now borrowing from Charles Taylor. And that's a word that seems to have better traction. So, again, the pattern that the words natural law express, I'm not challenging. And Peugeot doesn't challenge it every time he says it's not arbitrary. He's the apostle of reason. Okay, what language are we going to use that does a better job at finding us together in agreement, acting out the patterns, to use Peugeot's terms? I don't know that Peugeot's terms will win. None of us can know. It takes decades and centuries for these things to finally emerge. We participate in this stuff, but we are tiny little nodes in the network, cogs in the wheel, if we want to go back to a mechanistic. We're figuring out the language as it goes along. Now, he's a philologist, and so the thing he does is pay attention to these changes in language. And so when he migrates from worldview to social imaginary, and at the end of this video, when Andrea says, "Can I just say worldview?" It's because it's already mapped on her, and it's not going to change that quickly.
So that was the model of Lewis's time. And what Lewis talks about in this book is how silly this sort of is. Not silly in that it's not useful. Obviously, it's been useful for a whole lot of things. But the idea that there's...
Now, part of the dynamic, and I think it's a feature, not a bug, is conflict within tribes, because this is sort of how we do our work. And again, I think you can see this in the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther sets out to reform the church that he loves. What takes place is a horrendous conflict, which will lead to war and bloodshed and all sorts of suffering. And, the Roman Catholic Church wants to burn Luther as a stake, as a heretic, just like it did to Jan Hus. Okay. In the end, did Luther reform the church? Yes. Strange way, through the Council of Trent. Mission accomplished. Did Luther reform monasticism? Yes. Strange pathway. This is how history works. This is the pattern.
like a law of gravity implies like there's a municipal physics court where if, somebody will write you a ticket if you violate the law of gravity or something like that. It's a metaphor, and it's kind of a funny metaphor if you think about it for very long. So the medieval model is different from this, and
this is key, because what on earth is Jonathan Peugeot doing? Jonathan Peugeot is sort of picking things up at the medieval model, having passed through the Protestant Reformation, and saying, I think we need to go back and look at all these things. But now again, what Peugeot is doing, and what Peterson is doing, and what I'm doing, and what Roland is doing, and what Andrea is doing, and what probably all of us are doing, is we're picking up the project, and we're saying we're going to use the tools of modernity, but we have to figure out how to do this together. So that's what we're doing.
He lays this out in primarily 4 works, or four authors. Okay. Chalcidius, Macrobius, Pseudo-Dionysius, or St. Dionysius the Areopagite, depending on what you want to call him, and then Boethius. So these are the 4 authors of what he calls the seminal period. And basically, these 4 authors together, the intellectual and mystical life built around the writings of these 4 authors really shapes the thinking of the Middle Ages, and it shapes the way that the people.
Was the time period, of these 4 authors? They were. Mm-hmm. It was the early medieval or even ancient.
Let's say within the first 500 to 600 years AD.
Okay.
Yeah. As far as for instance, the Dionysian corpus, most people
see that question that Andrew just asked. That is such an important question. And of course, what we too often do on YouTube is we just sit here and, I wonder when they were. I'm not going to ask that, because then I'm not going to look very learned. But she asked the question. That's what makes her good at this.
Most scholars would say now it was written around the 500s, okay. But there are some people who would take a more conservative view that's actually much older than that. But in any case, it's certainly a tradition that, let's say, solidifies around the 500s, something like that.
Okay.
So, basically, the works of these authors create a way of thinking about and interacting with the world that thinks of a world that's not held together by laws, but a world that is held together by love. Right?
Right.
But now, again, be careful with that word love, because, see, this is where the church and pastors are so important, because what I have in my mind when you use that word are all of the people that assemble back here in this room and all the people I talk to. Because what he's thinking about as love, what someone in late antiquity is thinking about as love, what some guy, if I grab him off the street and start talking about him as love, there's a lot of different stuff going on there, baby.
Why do rocks fall down when you drop them? Because they're trying to get back to earth, right? Everything's sort of drawn. Chaucer's phrase for this is kindly inclining. In other words, moving towards the thing that is your kind, right? Everything's trying to get sort of back to its.
Now, right there, a bunch of you are going to jump up and say, hey, wait a minute. We've got the elements in there, and rock falls to earth because it wants to be reunited with its kind. That's not true. That's rock falls to earth because of gravity. Okay, explain gravity to me. You might have a really wonderful model for gravity, but I don't know that you can explain it to me. Maybe because of my own dense nature. But this is the issue.
To its origin point. And so Boethius then says, and Chaucer following him, that because the soul comes from God, the soul is made to make the ascent to God.
Now, if you say that to people, well, suddenly we're going to get Gnostic-y here. That's probably where a lot of Christians are going to go. And so there's a lot going on here. But again, language is important.
Right. So this idea that everything's sort of trying to get back to its origin point. So it's a way of thinking about the world as being held together, drawn together by not by law, but by love. And this makes it possible for somebody, for instance, like Dante, who is sort of the, let's say, the end point of the great medieval synthesis. Post Dante, things start to fall apart. It's not really Dante's fault. It's just like he's a convenient dividing line, let's say.
Okay.
Now it's very interesting because things start to fall apart. Well, what is that going to mean? In what way do they fall apart? What do you mean by things start to fall apart? And it's tough to put your finger on, but it's a whole lot of discomfort.
So that makes it possible for Dante, when Dante is talking about sin in Purgatorio, he actually gives us two different views on sin in the Divine Comedy. There's the view on sin that we get in Inferno, and then in Purgatorio, the view of sin that we get is that there are sins which are caused by a lack of love. There are sins which are caused by an excess of love. In other words, loving good things to like more than they deserve. Right. So this goes back to the idea that this is in Aristotle. St. Augustine talks about this, the idea of the ordo amoris, the ordering of the affections, the ordering of the loves. So the idea would be that you can love. Food is a good example, right? It's not wrong to love food, right? God gave us food. Food is good. It's not wrong to love food, but if you love food too much, then it becomes the sin of gluttony, right? And gluttony has its own sort of natural consequences, but from the medieval perspective, you wouldn't say, "Oh, don't eat too much, or you'll become obese and get diabetes." They would say, I mean, that might happen, probably will.
Yeah.
But what they would say is, don't eat too much because you will deaden your soul to God.
There's an example of language which doesn't seem to work, doesn't it? And so now what happened with gluttony in terms of, well, natural law means that if you love food too much, you get fat and get diabetes. Well, some people get fat and diabetes. Some people can eat everything they want and they don't gain a pound. Oh, but then there are now, you see, so what did we go into in the modern period? Well, a whole lot of mediation. Well, what are those structures of mediation? Well, it's really God number one. But we didn't recognize that as God. And actually, again, I like my metaphor that I used with Rationality Rules video, where think about a puzzle on a table, the God of the gaps. Well, the gap is you're seeing through the table. Well, where do the pieces come from? The pieces come up from God.
Right, so that the more important
that's
thing,
quite
the more
the thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, for instance, Saint Seraphim of Sarab. Now, this is going east a little bit, which I'm going to try not to do so much until the end. And in a little bit, I'd like to talk about the things that C.S. Lewis gets wrong about the Middle Ages, because I think that would be a fun conversation.
Yeah, I'm curious.
We'll come back to that. But Saint Seraphim of Sarab, who's a Russian ascetic and mystic, he says it is impossible to comprehend the mysteries of God on a full stomach, right? Which is could seem like an extreme thing to say to a lot of people.
Well, he is an ascetic.
He is an ascetic, yeah. But also, I mean, there's, when we talk about comprehending the mysteries in the Orthodox Church, we mean eating. So, it's like,
ooh, we are bumping up into language hard right now.
The mystery, right, is communion. It's the Eucharist,
of course,
and so
right.
So we go fasting to the mystery, which is a nice phrase from Lewis, actually. So anyway, all that to say, they would say don't eat too much, not because you might get diabetes, but they'll say don't eat too much because if you start turning your heart towards earthly pleasures, and that the love for those earthly pleasures becomes disordered.
Now, you can already feel the tension. This dude used to be a Baptist minister, and he's traveled a long ways from those days, because you use this language in a Baptist church. How far is that going to go? All this translating that has to happen, because all this language is situated. And James K. Smith has these liturgies, and they're sort of liturgies of the ordinary. And the vast majority of people are embedded in these liturgies. A little bit later in this video, he'll talk about, going to church daily, and this is where, there is, in a sense, with a lot of these conversations, and I see it all the time in religious communities, and it's completely understandable. If only we could get back to the Reformational period. And so Protestant scholars, will study Luther and Calvin and Menno Simons and, lights of the Reformational period, obsessively. And if we could only get back to Geneva, Calvin's Geneva, or Zwingli, Zurich, sometimes if we could only get back to the Middle Ages, if we could only get back to the Renaissance, in terms of if we could only get back to the classical periods where they carved the sculptures that we are digging up and giving all of our attention to. Okay. If we can only get back to the early church, Bill Hybels, Bill Ezekian, Willow Creek, we want to have, what Willow Creek wanted to have was a New Testament church in the northern suburbs of Chicago. And of course, the Orthodox weighed in and say, we look the closest like the New Testament church. Maybe. And, there's some evidence for that. And now we're in the middle of it. So, natural law. God number one, God number two. Pattern, 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 pattern. How can we put this stuff together? All right, I don't want to spoil this video because Andrea can use the hits. But I want to jump out to the end of it, because I think what he lays down here is sort of a nice illustration of what I agree with you're really trying to get to in terms of natural law. And what I think in many ways Jordan Peterson is trying to get at in terms of the God, even though Jordan Peterson is really stuck between God number one and God number two. And I think the example that Richard Rowland gives right here is really terrific.
As far as what I think is coming next.
Well, as far as, is it similar in the sense of, like, we like things ordered in the scientific space, but then everyone not properly done because it's just...
Everything likes things ordered. Okay, so let me give you two different pictures of order, right?
Okay.
Let's say that I cut a branch off of a tree, okay, and I set that branch down on the table. Is that branch ordered? Like, are the leaves ordered on that branch?
I mean, yes, they're in the place that they grew into.
Right, they're in their proper place. And nature is like fairly, like, on its own, usually pretty beautiful, right? Like, if you don't monkey with it. So if I take a branch and cut it off a tree, and and I look at that branch, I put it on the table. Of course, the branch.
Even just if you don't monkey with it, what do we mean by that word? So we have this idea that what a monkey does is, but that's probably a monkey in a room of ours. What do monkeys do out in branches and trees? Well, they don't disrupt nature. What do we mean by nature? Why, even today, do we still have this idea of natural global warming versus man-made global warming? Why do people go all over the place for natural food or organic food? Say it again. I'm not saying that these words, I think law is actually the most problematic of the two, but I think nature is deeply compromised because it's connected to all sorts of other things. Okay, back to this really terrific illustration.
Branch has been cut pretty beautiful, right? Like, and nature is like fairly like on its own usually pretty beautiful, right? Like if you don't monkey with it. So if I take a branch and cut it off a tree, and and I look at that branch, I put it on the table. Of course, the branch is out of place, but for my illustration, it has to be on a table. Okay. So I look at that branch, and I can see every leaf on this branch is in its proper place, right? So we could say this branch is ordered. Now, if I strip every leaf off of that tree, and I sort those leaves according to size, shape, and color, and then I cut up that branch into twigs, and I sort the twigs according to length and thickness, and I lay all that out on the table, is that ordered?
It's our modern version of ordered.
Yeah, it's very organized, right? So I've put everything in a place based on a category that I have forced upon it, but it's no longer a branch.
Okay, right? So that's the difference. So that is the, like, we like it ordered the same as the medievals liked it ordered, but our versions of ordered is exceedingly different.
So, natural law and ordered, which is a better word? How does natural law fit in with his branch illustration? And I think actually his ordered illustration is better. But this to me is an example of this is good teaching. And it really works much better.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So everyone wants to order things, right? But you can order things like in a natural way, and that's what the whole idea of being of things
in a natural way, yet a storm comes through and branches are ripped down, and we say, well, that's disordered. The storm has disordered the tree. Here in Northern California, we might have a very bad fire season this year. And how is that going to, well, what would a very bad fire season mean? It would mean that these, many, many square miles of beautiful forests that are surrounding this bowl in which I live, which is the Central Valley, will burn because we've had a dry year. And biologists will tell you that fire is a natural part of this ecosystem. Okay. So is it ordered that these trees burn and our skies fill with smoke? And then others will say, well, it's this year of drought is part of it. And I don't want to get into that whole thing, but it gets very complicated. Okay, where is natural law in this? And so I think, this is part of my, I'm going to let the Thomists be the Thomists. I'm going to let the natural law folks be the natural law. And I completely understand why my God number one aligns up with natural law, and why I think the God number one business is, in fact, the thing to point a light to in terms of the question of why Jordan Peterson is having the effect that he's having. Because what he is reintroducing to the West is God number one. And the strange line that Jordan Peterson seems to be hung up on is God number two. And so he acts as if God is personal. He sits at the edge of his bed and he prays. And Sam Harris doesn't know either where that answer comes from.
Kindly inclining, right? In other words, that's what the whole idea of things kindly inclining, right? In other words,
remember he just said that. He says, I prefer that language, kindly inclining. And I would suspect that many would too, because the kindly inclining better expresses a spirit of finesse and a relational posture, all that nuance in that language, which natural law is rather tyrannical.
Things are doing what their nature makes them to do, and they're being drawn together by love, right? That's one way of ordering.
I think that language will sell
your world, and if you try to order your life that way, then what you will find is you'll fall into a certain kind of relationship with your husband, a certain kind of relationship with your children, a certain kind of relationship with God and the people around you, and it'll be lovely and it'll be beautiful. It won't be perfect because you're going to get things wrong. But even when you get things wrong, there's an orderly way to fix them, right? But the other thing,
the old order chaos, that's Jordan Peterson stuff. That's working. That's gaining traction with people.
you could do is to try to take some outside order that is not in accordance with your nature, as a human being.
Now, your nature. See, again, I think law is stuff is so hard.
How do you
As a
mean?
woman, as Andrea, if I was going to, Chesterton has a bunch of great characters in his books, in his fiction, that are good examples of this, right? But let's say that I decide I'm going to live my life totally according to scientific principles, right? And I'm going to just...
Scientific principles. Well, there's language that comes from someplace.
I'm going to data monitor every aspect of my life, and then I'm going to, so I can find out, like, what's the optimum temperature for my coffee in the morning. And
what's interesting is that in many ways, scientific principles is sort of the updating of application of natural law. Because natural law and science, well, they line up one place. Principles, well, that's the action that we live by.
And what's the optimal, food pairings so that I have the right amount of energy and libido and, and like I fall asleep at the right time and don't get and just like order and like hyper measure every one of these things and basically say, so an ideal human life is hitting these statistical averages. So I've got to make sure that all my measurements are within those statistical averages.
Is that natural law? Natural law, scientific principles.
Right. Well, it might work for a while, but two things would end up happening. One is that I would end up getting just totally burned out because you can't give that much attention to every part of your life. Right. Mm-hmm. In fact, it's wrong to give that much attention to every part of your life. You really shouldn't give as much attention to your food as you give to your prayer. Mm-hmm. And if you do, then your life is disordered. Right. But
prayer. Now we're coming into God number 2 here.
So one is I'm gonna burn out because I'm just giving too much attention to everything. Mm-hmm. Right. And the other thing that's going to happen is that other people are going to look at me and be like, actually, Richard's not a normal person. Like, you shouldn't live like this. Right. Because
norm. Well, there's law. There's a law, but if you use normal and use law, people hear it differently.
Because what they're going to see is like because my attention is all going to be in the wrong place, and I'm going to have stopped living according to love, and now I'm living according to trying to hit this hypothetical perfect statistical life, right? Okay, this is like on a micro scale, that's what we're trying to do in our society right now.
Right, but then there's things coming back that, like you kind of alluded to it. So now we're kind of turning back, and margins are pushing into the center in ways that might not be the best. But what do you do when you push them away and try to pretend like they don't exist? And there's all these different versions of things happening outside of the order that our parents and grandparents thought existed in society.
Now, parents and grandparents are really important to us because they're the ones that we remember. They're the ones that we have a picture of that mapped onto us pretty directly. But in terms of a sample of the spans of time by which these things are being processed, they're a very small sample.
So the things are coming back. So are parts of the medieval model coming back, I guess, is really... That's how I'll form it in a question rather than a statement.
Yeah. What I would say is that Christ is always new but never novel.
Okay.
That's a great way to say it.
So Christ has this capacity in his story, in his person, to renew everything, like to constantly make things new. Right, he has a way to integrate paganism, right? But he also has a way to integrate the good things about modernism. So as we start.
So again, I don't have a beef with natural law. I think, in fact, Jordan Peterson's God and the God that he is bringing back into the realm is a rebalancing of what has been imbalanced for a time, which is why his conversations with Sam Harris was so important. And that moment that happens about 3/4 of the way into the conversation where Sam Harris finally says, well, tell me what you mean by God. The Jordan Peterson takes God number one, sort of to the limits of God number one, natural law sort of to the limits of natural law. And at some point you want to know, is there a lawgiver? Because the law is a category of complexity lower, significantly lower than the lawgiver. And the law given at Sinai is an expression of the same God. Now I'm showing myself to be a Calvinist and not a Lutheran. Is an expression of the same God when the Spirit comes, and now the Spirit enables the believers to fulfill the law. And again, I was dealing with my men's group last night. We're in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a tremendously complex thing to wrestle with. And so this is natural law, fine, but it's about the lawgiver. And the lawgiver, that the author that gives us the arena, and then the arena itself is agentic in many ways, but then he goes forward to place himself within the arena, and bang. That's why Christ fills it up, as Peugeot says, from top to bottom. That's why Christ, as Abram Kuyper says there's not one square inch here that I can't claim. That's why Christ separates sheep and goats. That's why Christ. And why Christ is worshipped as God. Not as a God. Although, no, as God. That's why this works. That's why we're seeing what's happening. And again, I don't want to spend my time fighting about natural law, because that's sort of an intramural Christian thing. Just like I don't want to spend my time fighting about, fighting the Calvinist Arminian feud. I think that's an agent arena fight that we're not going to resolve just, here we've got Romans 9 through 11. Here we've got the beginning of Ephesians. Here we have Joseph saying, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. I'm not as interested in fighting those. I'm interested in the frontier of where we're at now and finding new language and new formulations and continuing the very long project of what we've been at all along. And so I don't think it's a mystery that the Orthodox come and say, we had a bunch of stuff buried in the basement, and I think this stuff might help. People looking around saying, that might be of some help. But I'm still, because we've all got our internal mappings all set. And so what we're doing is and again, I count the atheists in the West as Protestants. That's why I put them in as Team Protestant. And so when Sam Harris looks at Jordan Peterson and says, that's not God, well, that's because Sam Harris only recognizes God number two. And Jordan Peterson has discovered God number one, but is still a little reluctant about God number two. But this Christ figure is interesting, and Peugeot is pushing at him. So to me, that's why all this. And Tom Holland is finding, God through history. And so, natural law, go ahead and use that language. But I don't know that the formulation will work with ordinary people now. So that's why I'm looking at other words. So I hope Bionic Mosquito, I hope I was kind, because again, I think there's a ton of use in Thomas and natural law, and he's quoting Chesterton. I mean, talk about teen Catholic. I've read what Chesterton writes about Calvinists, and Richard Rowland will make a comment. He seems to be a nice Calvinist, but I'll go back to Lewis's Mere Christianity and the Orthodox and the Catholics and the Calvinists, and we're on Team Christian, and now we've got Monster Sam in the estuary, who's saying, well, what about that Trinity? Now you can ban him from the estuary. Say, you must be Trinitarians. What's that going to do with the atheists? They don't believe. Neil Plantinga's definition of a Unitarian was they believe in one God at most. Now Sam he's a crunchy Unitarian, let's say. But this is what we're doing here. And so, and I realize all the various different tribes, it's just natural of your tribe is that as you're so passionate about your tribe that we want everyone around. And, that's a part of the Jordan Peterson dynamic. We get excited when he seems to say things that our tribes have said. We feel validation. That's just how human beings are wired together. It's how we're always working on our mutual maps. But I think this is the moment that we're at. And so order, some of these words are showing traction. And like I said, I'm interested in, like Freddie said, reeling them in. So anyway, go ahead and push back. I love it. That's what an estuary is for. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment.